me a second. I'm used to my voice coming back at me. I'm not used to these. So now I'm going to introduce the topic today, land piracy in the Golden Age, or this wicked age. The way I like to do these presentations is this is fun history, and so I encourage audience feedback or questions. Anytime you have a question or you want to add something, that I'm very much welcome that. But the Golden Age of Piracy. So what was the Golden Age of Piracy? I also ask a lot of questions. Audience. When I'm talking about the Golden Age of Piracy, we're going to talk about the famous pirates, the ones that stick out in everybody's minds, are the hooks and all things like that. I'm going to explain who they were, how they fought, how they lived, and why they became who they became. So we go to the next slide. This is the most dangerous of the pirates. This is Captain Two Hooks Jenkins. For some reason, he has 2 hooks and 3 legs. He was a scourge of the Atlantic. If you didn't like taking that picture, it's not happening. All right, next slide. So, what is a pirate's favorite letter? R. Everybody agree? They didn't have any. They couldn't read. Next slide, please. So, what is a pirate? Anybody want to answer that? Or what was a pirate? This is one of those questions that everybody has an answer in their head, but it's more difficult to articulate. Pirate is basically a sea robber. Talk about maritime piracy, not electronic piracy. And so what is a pirate? And the reason I put myself up there in my youth was I was actually accused of piracy by the United States Navy. I was in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I was on a patrol boat. My partner and I ended up escorting a Cuban tug in international waters when it was pulling something, and so we had to stop, pull stuff out of the water. Well, we got pulled off the water immediately and taken into our lieutenant's office, stand at attention. And our mast chief was yelling at us, accusing us of, being nothing but pirates for doing that. It had the opposite effect because my friend and I, it was the greatest moment of our life, being pirates. It defined us, and ever since then, Jimmy Buffett has had a whole new meaning in my life. So, next slide, please. Oops. Pirate myths. We're all familiar with the pirate myths. See Captain Hook, Walk the Plank, Parrots, Treasure Island. What are some pirate myths that anybody wants to? Well, what about buried treasure? Buried treasure is a big one. But think about it. Why would they bury their treasure? Don't you want to spend it? Would anybody here, if they came with a bunch of money, go bury it? They didn't either. Peg legs, one eyes, the plank. All of this is made up. In fact, a lot of these stereotypes come about from the book Treasure Island. And as we'll talk about today, we can dispel some of the rumors, but before we even go, I want to dispel a lot of these rumors. First, walk the plank. Would there even be a point to walking the plank? That was not a thing. Peg legs and hooks. Why would that be a problem if you're on board a wooden sailing ship? Yeah, you have to be able to hand, reef, and steer. If you don't have a hand, what are you going to do? A hook is not something you can really mess around with. Rope clip. Eyes, one eye. In fact, there is an element of truth to the eye patch, but it's not because they're missing eyes. It's because they need night vision. When they go from the day down to the dark decks, they switch the patch over to the other eye and they'll be able to see. But like stereotypes in history, there are a lot of kernels of truth to the stereotypes. Next slide, please. This is more what pirates look like. This is Anne Reed and Mary Reed and Bonnie. Women pirates. But if you look at the way they're dressed like how sailors dressed at the time. The baggy pantaloons, the jackets, different kind of hair. In fact, sailors are what pirate crews were made up of, almost exclusively. And so this isn't even contemporary. This 19th century drawing gives us the best idea of what pirates would look like. Next slide. And then there's a few terminology. Sailing vessels, different kind of ships for different kind of missions, different kind of uses. But the basic is you have a ship. It is a 3-mast rigged ship with square sails, and so it has the 3 masts, and you see the stair swell, and then you have the triangle squares in the corner. And you have a brig. A brig is a small ship. Schooner is like a modern schooner, and then you have a cutter. One square rig or triangle rigged ship. Pirate ships, we all picture them as ships, these big massive ships with guns galore, crews galore, and those are really the exception, such as Queen Anne's Revenge or Blackbeard and others. Most pirate ships were schooners or cutters, or at the very least brigs. Why would schooners and cutters be the best for pirates? Fast. They're also shallow draft. Where, if these ships with their big shallow or their big deep drafts, where can't they go? They can't go in rivers, they can't hide. And it's fact these small boats, these small ships, this is how they eluded the Royal Navy for such a long time. And so when I discuss, just keep these in mind, these types of ships. Next. For all of this to make sense, we have to talk about the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world, we're familiar with colonialism, the British Empire, the French, the Spanish Empire, where they settled the Spanish Empire. South America, western part of the United States, the French mostly up in New Canada, or modern day Canada. And then we have the English, 13 colonies, and then we have the Sugar Islands. Most of us have heard the term triangle trade. It's an oversimplification of the way things worked. And part of the triangle trade, you had go with Britain, trade with the United States, or sorry, not the United States, 13 colonies, trade to Africa, vice versa, you had a triangle. It was much different than that. Different goods came from different places and enclosed itself into one system. And so the Spanish system of imperialism was all about feeding the mother country. They went to the New World, they exploited first the natives, and then African slaves. They mined for gold, silver, and whatnot. They loaded up on big galleons and sailed back to Spain. The British, on the other hand, created this mercantile system. This mercantile system, after the navigation laws, had a closed system for the British. Laws stated that most of the crew had to be British or English citizens. Nobody could trade with the colonies, and the colonies couldn't trade with anybody else in Europe, unless there's other circumstances. And so the way it worked, again, simplification is manufactured goods in England, trade for stuff in the United States, such as raw goods, wheat, indigo, rice. You bring that to the West Indies. Also, you have the slave trade, or Eastern or Western Africa. You trade for guns, manufactured goods here in Western Africa, and you bring it over to the colonies where you trade for other goods, and it goes into a system. So if you follow ship voyages during this time, you'll see them may have stopped here in Western Africa, but they'll stop in Barbados, South Carolina, Boston, and then maybe back to Great Britain. Shipbuilding and the maritime economies were big thing in Britain, big thing in the United States. And then closing this system and the exploitation and the way it worked is how piracy, the Atlantic piracy gold age, really took off. It wouldn't have worked in other contexts. Going with the slave trade. Just some diagrams of how the slave trade looked. I don't know, it's not very clear if you close up, but these are how they packed slaves in. And so slaves were valued as sort of capital. I hate to reduce people to capital, but they were very valuable again. But these ships would be loaded with all sorts of valuable goods. The Spanish system is important at first because you load these galleons up with gold, silver, and sail them straight back to Spain. What does that do? They're these fat, slow galleons. Who's that a great target for? Pirates. Next slide. So, the Atlantic world. Treaty of Tordesillas is an important backdrop for the early piracy. 1494, the Pope, after decides to split the world, the New World, in sections. Everybody from this line here, everything is under the rule of Spain. Everything from this line over is under the rule of Portugal. So that's why Brazilians speak Portuguese. Next slide. I misplaced that one. Actually, no, I didn't. And so, before pirates, we get this idea of privateers. Privateers are fascinating to me because it's legalized pirates. What happens is these aren't military ships, naval ships, these are civilian ships that are fitted out or specially built to serve as pirates. They are issued a letter of marque and reprisal. This letter of marque, say signed by the Queen or colonial governor, gives the ship captain the right to attack their enemy's trade. They would never go against another enemy's navy because that was suicide. And most of the early piracy is built around privateers. Now, something interesting. The only nation in the world that still has legalized privateering is the United States. It is written into our Constitution that we can have privateers. Everybody else is outlawed. And so every now and then, which including this most modern Ukraine-Russian conflict, you'll see someone trying to bring up reintroducing privateers. It's interesting. Next slide. So the first wave is the Queen Elizabeth or Elizabethan sea dogs. Next slide. Elizabethan sea dogs. This lasts from about 1560 to 1605, and you'll have the famous, such as Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, Raleigh, Francis Raleigh, and vice versa. They were defined by attacking Spanish shipping. Treaty of Tordesillas especially shaped this because Spanish controlled all of America. Everybody who was Catholic was afraid to do it. However, the British or the English were not Catholic. They were Church of England. But England could not afford itself to launch colonial efforts. And so instead of launching their colonial efforts per se, they would use privateers or these sea dogs to sail around and plunder Spanish shipping and colonies. They were so successful at it, especially Sir Francis Drake, who made one of the first circumnavigations in the globe, trying to chase Spanish ships into the Atlantic and the Pacific. Others, Sir John Hawkins. A lot of these men also became more famous in 1588 when they went back to England and fought in the Spanish Armada. Next slide, please. Here's Sir Francis Drake's ship, the Golden Hind. This is a facsimile of what it might have looked like. I'm sorry, I lost my balance there. I put this because it's important. These early galleons, these Spanish galleons, they're tall ships. They have a castle and they have a forecastle. They're slow, but they're big. The bigger the ship, the more guns. You put men up here, they can fire their guns, and so a lot of these ships would have large crews, especially privateering ships. As time went on, the ships would become more advanced and faster and better sailing. Next, please. Then we get to the Buccaneering period. This is 1650 to Queen Anne's War, to around 1700. This is defined by captains like Henry Morgan, the French Buccaneers, and other captains, and this is also legalized privateering that helped shape the piracy world. Buccaneers, French, big game hunters were living on Hispaniola. They would hunt game and occasionally row out and attack Spanish shipping. They get their name from the type of meat that they would cure, pecan, which, they would get their name. So they first were on Hispaniola once the Spanish government pushed them out. They moved on towards Tortuga. When they went on Tortuga, this is when they upped their game, and so you get these French Catholics, or these French raiders sailing out, attacking French ships coming back to their island. The other ones, though, the Protestant English attacking the Spanish and their colonies and their shipping. The big one's Henry Morgan, and this is where you get such forts as Port Royal, the famous one. Before Port Royal was wiped off the earth by God, it was a big pirate haven. Henry Morgan was not only a captain, but also became a political leader. He's famous for the sack of Portobello. Here's an artist rendition. He sacks Portobello. He attacks other Spanish colonies. He's ultimately successful, but one of the most successful things he does is he takes Jamaica for the English.
You asked a question?
Yes.
Did these captains own the ships that they were on? Did he own that ship, or did someone else own the ship and he would stay on it?
Oh, and this time, he owned it. He would have owned this ship. but not everybody. Merchant ships were owned by owners, Navy, obviously the Navy. But these ships were stolen or they were theirs, vice versa. But these weren't state ships, these were private ships with a letter of marque. So his ship was his ship. Next slide, please. The pirate round, and this is where we start to see the rise of the Golden Age. We start to see the big names like Henry Avery. Henry Avery is credited with starting the new type of piracy that moves into the Golden Age, and I'll explain in a second. Henry Avery successfully sails into the Red Sea, attacks a ship belonging to the Mogul Emperor. He takes the ship and he just finds a fortune. He's successful. He at first ravages the Mogul's daughter, and then they marry. He takes that success and he brings it back to the Americans. And from this success, I'm going to bump into pirate havens or the markets. None of this would have been successful if there weren't markets for these goods. Before the English, Spanish, and French were really able to establish control over their colonies, or complete or tighter control, colonies used to be pirate nests. People would come in there, such as Henry Avery. They would offload their cargoes that they stole, and some unscrupulous merchant would sell it, making great profits for everybody. Henry Avery was so fancy or so successful that Philadelphia sails into the Delaware Bay. His first mate marries the governor, or lieutenant governor's daughter, and most of Philadelphia's currency after this was the gold found on this ship. This prompted the royal governor, or the English, the king, to revoke William Penn's charter for a time in order to gain more control. Next slide, please. Here's Henry Avery's flag. This is the Jolly Roger, one of Jolly Roger's many sort of seats at the time. Next slide, please. William Kidd, he's another famous one. William Kidd is a very interesting story. He was actually a pirate hunter. He was sent out to track down pirates. One other thing about this time was pirates didn't just operate in the Atlantic, they would also go to the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, Madagascar, places like this. His pirate hunting eventually turned to piracy, and he was captured and sent back to England to be hanged and gibbeted. Gibbeted, they would put you at the mouth of the harbor. You would be dead. They put you in this cage and let you rot there for years as a warning to other sailors. The interesting thing about Captain Kidd is his trial in England was a lot more, they didn't have the infrastructure for it to try everybody in England. So after Kidd, they moved the law to have admiralty courts in every colony in which they would try pirates there in the colony. But before Captain Kidd, they had to go back to England. Next, please. And then we get into the age that we're going to talk about today, the post-Queen Anne's War, 1713 to about 1725. And so now we're going to talk about the pirates. Who were the pirates? Piracy is different in this age, as it's no longer the age of big captains. It's the age of sailors turned pirates. And so we'll go over a few things. Jack tar. Sailors at the time dressed differently, acted differently, spoke differently from people, from their contemporaries. Sailors at the time also were just about the only people that were people of the world. So much to the fact that scholars would go down to the docks and derive a lot of information from them because these sailors ended up in many different ports. They dress funny. Again, compared to everybody else, you have the baggy pants, the jackets, vice versa. And does anyone know why they were called Jack Tars? They would coat their clothes in tar to protect against the elements. They also were able, people could tell the difference between sailors and everybody else by the way the sailors walked. The sailors actually kind of walked with the gait. I can't really, but a weird way of walking. Why would they walk weird like that? Sea. And so if you've been to a life at sea, you're going to walk strange on land. Their distinct way of dressing, their distinct way of speaking, their distinct way of their mannerisms, all set them apart. But I'm going to go to a distinct way of talking. So we get the whole, we read these stereotypes. There's a little bit of truth to that. Sailors did speak much different than everybody else. So they use more cusses, they curse God more. But the fact is going port to port, all these different languages and cultures they run into, they're going to pick up Pidgin English or Pidgin languages. And so now their languages would be mixed with African slang, African words. Pull up Portugal, you might pick up a little Portuguese. All you pull into some island, the native community might pick up a little bit of that. And so, as men of the world, their language was defined by the mixture of the cultures, and then with maritime or nautical tradition, the way they talk. Names of parts on the sea are much different than names on land. And so their language was very much molded after their lives on the sea and as men of the world. They were also the only ones who had tattoos and the only people in society that had earrings. Scurvy, when they would go out to sea, life at sea was not pleasant for these men. Hard work, low pay. Scurvy was one of the many diseases. It was marked by the lack of vitamin C and B until 1747 when they discovered a cure. However, it turns out that sailors who ate rats were very much immune to scurvy as opposed to those who didn't. Does anybody know why? Rats synthesize on vitamin C. And so those men down the villages plucking up rats to eat because they're very hungry were actually helping themselves stay healthy. Scurvy is marked, your gums will recede, your eyes will sink, you'll turn yellow. But one of the worst parts of scurvy is if you have an old scar, it'll open back up. And so I have an old appendix scar. If I had scurvy, it's start bleeding. It's not a disease, it was wasting away. A lot of men died at sea because of scurvy diseases. In fact, many more sailors died from accidents and disease than they ever would in combat. Next slide, please.
So was that in the 1700s when they realized that citrus stuff?
They did. It was 1747 after Anderson's voyage. One of the ways they figured out was also the Irish sailors had a penchant for whiskey, and they also liked to put citrus in their whiskey. So the Irish sailors, for some reason, were more healthy at times than the English sailors. However, whiskey was illegal on ships, and so when they found out that the Irish sailors were drinking whiskey, they would take it from them, and then all of a sudden now the Irish sailors were getting sick. Alcohol was a big part of shipboard life. We've all heard grog. You can't transport water for such a long time without it becoming disgusting. So how do you clean water? You dump rum in it. Then they mix it, and then where do you get their rum rations or their grog rations? And also get the word groggy because he's drunk. So a lot of these men drank out to sea, and they heavily drank port, and alcohol was a big part of their culture. They also received rum rations for the day, vice versa. They actually had to put guards in front of the rum stores to keep these sailors from taking it. Sorry. Oh, just, I didn't hear that. Awesome. Oh. So, sailors. Life as a sailor was not an enviable life. In fact, it was a hard life, and a lot of these men came from poor neighborhoods of London and other maritime cities. One contemporary observed that no man will be a sailor who is constant enough to get himself into jail. For being in a ship is being in a jail with the chance of drowning. The same person went on to say a man in jail has more room, better food, and commonly better company. So, who in your mind would be these sailors? You get the dregs, the unemployed. A lot of them to see as children, others would see as young men. A big thing that drove a lot of these people in urbanized England was the common or the enclosure movement, which they enclosed all the land, putting the peasants towards the cities. With this excess of people and the need for ships in the British system, sailors were first very much in demand and the only occupational choice many of them had. It's the old adage, you're free to work or you're free to starve. Also, sailors had to deal with impressment. The Royal Navy, in times of need, needed to fill up its ships, and in order to do that, they would impress sailors. They would go around the port, and they would sometimes violently remove you, as this 18th century painting shows. This is dramatic, but you see the man here, and his wife begging her not to take him. The press gets a bad rep for a good reason, but it's also very misunderstood. Has anybody here served in the Navy or the Merchant Marine or sailed? So those of you, if a press gang bursted in right now, the three of us would be taken. That's it. They wouldn't go after anybody else. Why would only the three of us be taken? We're sailors. They know why our attitude, our speaking. So everybody else would be fine. So if they burst into a tavern, if you're just some dock worker from Navy or sometimes too, but if you're just some guy, you wouldn't have to worry about it. Sailors constantly had to worry about it. You would put in the Royal Navy, and sometimes years or never before you got off. Next slide, please. Sailors were also heavily exploited. The system would not have worked without Atlantic sailors. It would not have thrived, but you need labor exploitation, and so the life of the ship, you had your captain and his mates or the officers, and you had the sailors. The captain had just about autonomy out at sea and almost total autonomy. That means with discipline. It's hard. Discipline was harsh. Work was harsh, especially on small merchant ships with a crew of maybe 15. The captain could be a tyrant, and often was a tyrant. They would fuck safety rules. They try to speed women up and down the yardarms to the point where they fall off and die. They would whip these men. They would do all sorts of things, abuse. But they would also not pay them. A lot of times they would feed them, and it was a very intolerable life. And so it's no surprise that a lot of these men did turn to sailor, or did turn to piracy. So pirates, one of my favorite historians, Eric Hobsbawm, pointed out, and these words are very true, but it says men can live without justice and generally must, but they cannot live without hope. And so pirates are a lot of things, but there's some inspiration from that. I think a lot of what happened to pirates was these men were looking for hope. Cotton Mather, the famous Boston preacher, he had intimate relations with the pirates, and he despised them and was doing everything he could to wipe them out. He called them sea monsters who have been the terror that have haunted the sea. Another one, this is Bartholomew Roberts talking about the conditions. In the merchant service, there's thin commons, low wages, and hard labor. In this, piracy, plenty of satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power, and who would not balance creditor on this side when all the hazards that is run for it? At worst, it's only, I can't see that. Summer. Look at two choking. No, a married life and a short one. That would be my motto. And it was a very married life, and it was a very short life. These men really had no expectations, especially in the Golden Age, of ever returning to the civilian world. The other ages, you could be a pirate like Henry Avery. You could retire back or be rich. In fact, Henry Avery did inspire a lot of these men. Another one, this is by...
Excuse me, did the crew of the pirate ships, was there a financial benefit for them, or did they get more money than if they were sailors just on a...
They did, and financials was a big reason for piracy. So one of the laws with fighting and privateering in the Royal Navy is if you take a prize, you take an enemy ship, that prize, if it gets condemned, and it's essentially an amnesty court, they condemn the cargo, will turn into a lawful prize. In the Navy or on privateer, they'll split out the winnings. On the Navy, the officers will get the lion's share of the prizes. Men, the decks will get a small bonus. Merchant ships, there's nothing like that, so you're stuck on your base pay. Privateers is much more profitable for everybody involved, from the owners of the ship to the captains, including sailors. Same thing when it comes to pirate ship, and we'll talk about pirate crew here in a minute, but when they would take a prize, they would share it out almost equally upon themselves. And so there was a lot of money, opportunities associated with it. William Fly, one of the last pirate captains that was being hung or hanged in Boston, said, "I shan't own myself guilty of any murder. Our captain has made use us barbarously. We poor men can't have justice done us. There is nothing said to our commanders. Let them never too much abuse us and use us like dogs, but the poor sailor." Next slide, please. We're going to go back to that one. Next slide, please. Villains of all nations. This is the age we're going to talk about that we're going to really hit. This is the post Queen Anne's War, the most successful and the most widespread piracy in history. It starts, Queen Anne's War. Queen Anne's War is the name of the War of Spanish Succession in the Americas. The Royal Navy versus the Spanish and the French. There's not enough ships for the Navy. The Navy wasn't. It was on its way. The Royal Navy was on its way to becoming a formidable fighting force, but at this time they won't do a lot of growing things. And so what happens if you need to attack an enemy ship but you don't have the ships for it? You're going to turn to privateering. And so they most definitely turned to privateering in Queen Anne's War to the point where it was widespread. Men from all over would join these privateer crews and make their way to the West Indies, where most of the fighting was taking place, because that's where most of the Spanish and French islands were. Interesting thing about privateers is you do not have to be a sailor to join a privateering crew. They prefer sailors, but they needed more men. Why would a ship need a lot more men than sailors? It's just like the Royal Navy. You have to fight the ship. And so when you go into battle, you need as many men as possible. You're going to have cannons, to shoot, to board, vice versa. And so a larger portion of the crew is just there as combatants rather than sailors. And so these men, brought from places like Bristol, London, Boston, Philadelphia, all became intertwined. Some of them in the trade of sailors during this war. After the war, Treaty of Utrecht, it redefines the Atlantic world. Among other things, England or Britain wins the right to Asiago, which is they earn the right, or not earn the right, but they were granted the right to be exclusive slave traders in the Spanish Empire and the New World. Another thing is, after the war, they decided, the Crown decided that that's it. We don't need privateers anymore, so good luck to everybody. This abundance of sailors, this abundance of unemployed sailors, would lead almost directly into piracy. They didn't want to go back in these lucrative pirateering ships back to the poor pay, lack of food, everything they could find in merchant service, and everybody tried to avoid the Navy as much as possible because the discipline there was brutal, food was not that good, and you could be put to death for various offenses. When the war ends, we start to see these privateer crews take it upon themselves to continue the war. A lot of them said they never claimed or agreed to the terms that they were at peace with or in France. And so at first, they follow on the tradition of attacking Spanish and French ships. This was a problem, especially if these English ships were attacking French and Spanish, because it was a peace treaty, the war's over. As time goes on, it starts to increase to the point where they don't just attack French and Spanish, they start to go after British ships. They start to go after a lot of British ships. Why would they start going after ships of their own nations? Because those are the most abundant, richly ships in the sea. The Spanish were the ones they wanted because they're fat and slow. The Spanish were not well guarded, but they're secrets. They had a way of getting around them. So if you were lucky, you could hit the Spanish treasure fleet that only sailed once a year or once every few years. That was the long story. But French, they weren't so active in the Caribbean anymore. The Anglo-Dutch wars reduced their footprint in the Caribbean, and so the English ships were everywhere. They had the cargo, and so they started attacking English ships. Now, they became villains of all nations. In other words, they decided that they were enemies of all mankind. It didn't matter what nation was supplying the ships, they were going to attack it and plunder them. Nassau, Bahamas. Nassau, Bahamas became their pirate haven. It became almost a pirate republic. Nassau was an English colony, but the English were not able to control it. Under Captain Benjamin Hornigold and others, they decided to take Nassau, turn Providence into a pirate haven, and that's where a lot of people would go to offload their cargoes and have shore leave. Benjamin Hornigold, there's a lot to say about him. He was a pirate. He was also Blackbeard's mentor. Blackbeard sailed under him. Hornigold was a Jacobite. Now, how much Jacobites really played into piracy for a while? But Jacobites, after the Glorious Revolution of 1689 or 88, they deposed, no, sorry, I got the wrong dates. They deposed James II, the Catholic, for William, or for his daughter, Queen Anne, set up the Jacobites, which felt that James II was the rightful ruler. Hornigold was part of that. You see these different books arguing whether he took on piracy as a Jacobite or not. He will turn pirate hunter, but him and other captains set up in Fort Nassau, or Nassau, took over Fort Nassau and guarded the harbor. Next slide, please. And so we see their ground. It's a lot of what they would take here in the Caribbean, but another thing, and this is unique to this kind of piracy, is North America. They wouldn't just keep their activity here in the West Indies. They would go to Boston, or off the coast of Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston. Charleston got hit a lot. Willing to Delaware. All these places, pirates would attack anywhere that there were ships coming in and out. Next slide, please. Fighting. Going back to the crew. These crews, pirates, took on a lot of crew members. How did one become a pirate? They only look for sailors, just like the rest. And so, if a ship surrendered, oftentimes they open a recruiting. These men wanted to go pirating. They had a choice. Later on, a lot of men didn't have a choice, and they were very much pressing the pirates. But these unemployed privateers, these sailors, privateers are owned and captained by a legitimate business owner and captain. So how does a legitimate business owner or captain decide to be a pirate? And the answer is they didn't. A lot of these became about from mutinies. A mutinous crew would rise up, take over the ship, likely kill the captain and his mates, and from there, they would take over the crew's pirates, and then they would select officers. Officers were much different in the pirate ship. These men were voted out of popularity, and they could be voted off. Very used to democracy. They also had different ways of living. Having come from an unequal system, they decided to do their best to create an equal system. Now, if you could go back up 2 slides to the pirate codes. Bartholomew Roberts' Pirate Code 1721 really pointed out, and just to go over this quick, because I really can't read it from here. He sets out pirate codes that talk about the rules on the ships, the spoils, all sorts of things. So no men on most of these ships were treated as better. Most men had the same amount of food, same amount of rations, same amount of money from his prizes. Equals. If your captain wasn't doing what you wanted him to do, you could just blow him out and put another captain in, which happened a lot. Black sailors. Pirate crews, a lot of them were made up from anywhere to 20% to 30% African Americans. How did an African American become a sailor if they were mostly slaves? A lot of the time, as I said earlier, safety is right. A slave ship. A lot of times, as I said, sailors would die. You need a certain amount of sailors to make it home, especially if you need to pump out the villages for water. If you have a slave ship, a disease breaks out amongst the slaves, leads its way up to the crew. Once a lot of them die, so now you need able hands to get the ship in port. So they go below, they pick some black or some enslaved Africans, bring them up, teach them how to sail, get themselves to port. Now when they arrive in port, the rest of the cargo is sold, this person now has a marketable skill. And because of the desperate need for sailors in the English or the British imperial system, being a sailor or having that skill was more important than their skin color in this particular context. And so these men with the skills, rather than being slaves, would now be sailors. And so 20 to 30%. There was even a black captain. His name was lost to history, and his crew was almost 9% African American. One of the things about these codes, it's easy to view pirates as almost admirable in this way, but they were one of the first democratic and almost socialist societies. Everything was equal. They set up a fund, almost like a Medicare fund, if you were injured or put ashore, but they would actually give you a severance, things like that. This is not something you will see, even in modern times, how equal the crew treated each other. There's always there are some that are more equal than others, but a lot of times these crews quested for equality, and you can see it reflected here in these codes. All right, go back. Fighting. So fighting. How did these pirates fight? We picture violent, bloody fights. Pirates are bloodthirsty. Pirates only want to plunder and kill. They were bloodthirsty, and they did want this, but that was the rarity. Pirates did not want to fight. Why would a pirate want to fight?
It's easier.
Much easier, he's absolutely right. It's much easier. Would you risk fighting? Well, you didn't have to. You
Bad
just.
for business.
Huh?
Bad for business.
Bad for business. I'm going to go die so everybody else can have to plunder? No. And so how they really did it was the use of the Jolly Warrior flags and terror. They would scare the crew into surrendering. And so how this would happen was you spot the sails on the horizon. You first figure out what it was, because you did not want to go against a Royal Navy warship, because they would decimate you. You find it to be a merchantman, you got to go after it. Now, keep in mind, these were incredibly slow chases, very anticlimactic, to the point people just do the whole routine. It lasted a very long time. This pirate ship would come in and slowly make way because they were a little faster, and by the time they made it, when they got close enough, they'd raise their flag, which means surrender or quarter. If the captain decided to fight, they would be much more bloody. It would make it very hard on the captain and the crew. A lot of times they didn't want to fight, the crew was just as afraid of the pirates, and so the majority of them surrendered. The pirates would come aboard, take everything they wanted. A lot of times they would burn the ship instead of capturing it. They would probably mistreat the captains. A lot of times they kill the captains or abuse them and mates. See the one to join the pirate crew, move on with their lives. Not all the time did these crews surrender. And this would be fighting. Fighting at the time was particularly bloody. Ship to ship, as you can imagine. They would run next to each other. Whoever had the weather gauge had the advantage. By the weather gauge means who has the advantage of the wind. So who's the wind is coming ship has the advantage in these battles. They'll come as close as they can, and when they get within gunshot or cannon shot range, they'll start firing upon each other. And then they'll go up into the arms with muskets, shoot at each other. The shooting is only the small part. Then they would throw hooks, bring themselves next to the ship, and that's when it would get incredibly violent. They'd swing over, jump over, net over to the other ship. You can see here, this is Blackbeard fighting. He's got right pistols. They would use pistol, fire it, because they didn't have time to reload. They'd also use pikes, a lot of spears, pikes, bludgeon instruments, cutlasses, swords, tomahawks, axes, anything they could to kill it. Another thing is they would make themselves out to be incredibly terrifying, paint their faces, scream, put fake teeth in them, chisel monsters, anything they could do to scare the crew into not fighting. If a captain refused to surrender, oftentimes they would torture and kill him. The no quarter. Sometimes they would extend it to the crew. Most of the time it was just the mates, and those who wanted to be pirates could. Other ones would be put ashore. This is where you get the whole bend on deserted islands. There's a lot of these sailors who didn't want to join the crew were put out on these islands. The Royal Navy was especially combative towards these pirates because the pirates represented a humongous problem. The pirates but they were a huge threat to the international system, to the trade system. They were unstoppable. They were hurting British mercantilism and had to be stopped. Another thing you can argue is that they were messing with social order. Britain, England had a very hierarchical society and everybody had their place. All of a sudden these men were turning that about. And so they launched a campaign to root out the pirates that was largely unsuccessful at first because the pirates were faster, had smaller ships, and could outrun them. Captain Woodes Rogers was sent to take over the Bahamas. He arrives in 1717 with a contingent of sailors and marines, takes over the island and is no longer a safe haven for pirates. And now you'll see piracy move its way, not just along the North American coast and the West Indies, but you'll see it will return back to Indo-Atlantic, or going to the Indian Ocean and use Madagascar. Next slide. We skip a bunch? We skip a bunch. Okay, sorry. No, sorry, we didn't. Go to the next one. Blackbeard. So we have different pirates that make themselves famous. This is where you get the colorful characters of these things happens. Blackbeard being the most colorful and most famous. Blackbeard is incredibly interesting because they don't know very much about him. A lot of what we know about these pirates comes across from a book from Captain Johnson called The General History of Pirates. It is unknown, but a lot of historians and historians and English teachers believe it was Daniel Defoe, but there's just as much argument that it wasn't. This is where we get these contemporary wood cuttings. The General History came out in 1726, so it's relatively close to the time. These are almost certainly exaggerated, but not by much. And Blackbeard was especially ruthless, and he was especially efficient as a pirate. He used terror. People were terrified of Blackbeard. And the way he used terror to get the crews to surrender is he'd come at night, he would put punks or wicks underneath his hat, which would give off smoke, but they would also give off a glowing light. If you see this man that has these legends built upon him, come onto your ship, and his face is full of smoke and he's glowing, it is going to scare the living anything out of you. He was very theatrical, but he was also very brutal. He wasn't just for show. The extent of his brutality is the extent of all pirates' brutality, as in it was a mixture of very brutal to not brutal. I mean, if that makes sense. Brutal. It's debated whether this happened, but it is long rumored that Blackbeard made a Portuguese sailor eat his ears, nose, and lips. They would torture their crew, the captured crews, all sorts of ways. Lash them in the sun, beat them, hit them with the whips, anything they could. A lot of times they were looking for information on what the cargo was or what other ships they were sailing with. In Blackbeard's case, he really needed to keep up with terror. Blackbeard would have a very renowned but short career as a pirate. Next slide, please. Here was Blackbeard's flag. This was well known. They would sew, because sailors were very good with the needle, they would sew these flags to distinguish. You see a flag, and it's a flag you don't know, they're going to fight these people. When you see this flag go up, and there's no way you're going to fight, you're going to give it up. Next slide. Queen Anne's Revenge. Blackbeard's ship was an example of a three-masted ship. He took this former slaver and turned it into a warship, probably the most powerful warship next to the Scarborough in the Atlantic at the time. He had a 40-gun ship, 20 guns on the side, and then you have the cannons on the top. This ship was so powerful that he was able to actually blockade Charleston Harbor with it. They would sit outside of Charleston Harbor and attack all the ships coming in and out. And he also blockaded Charleston Harbor because he needed a cure for his sailors or for his crew's STDs. And that was one of his demands. I don't want to get too graphic, but as curing things at the time is has a lot to do with mercury and injections where you don't want to be injected, and it wasn't pleasant. He meets his alternate fate, which I'll get to in a second. Go down. Under him, next slide, please. We have Steve Bonnet. Steve Bonnet is hilarious and sad and terrifying at the same time. They call him the gentleman pirate. Does anybody know why he was called the gentleman pirate? Because he was a gentleman. He was not of modest birth or poor or a sailor like these other men. He was actually a major in the Barbados militia. He had a plantation on Barbados. He was a learned man. He was a gentleman. One day, he buys his own ship. He pays a crew and he goes pirating. He was very much a dandy. He was not an effective pirate, but nonetheless. Next slide. Calico Jack Records. Right on to him. So something happens as Wood Rogers is getting towards Nassau. Pirates are hard to stop. So King George I decides to issue a proclamation saying that anybody who comes forth gets a pardon and promises not to return to piracy will do so. A lot of men do come and get their pardons. A few of those actually go back to pirating. The pardons don't work like intended, and piracy picks back up. Steve Bonnet went to get he achieved his pardon, but instead of going back to Barbados and back to his life, he actually takes up pirating again. He falls into Blackbeard. Blackbeard takes advantage of him, takes over his ship, and puts Steve Bonnet ashore. Steve Bonnet will get his ship back. He will continue pirating until he is captured off the coast of Charleston and hanged. Blackbeard, he gets into an all-out fight with the Royal Navy captain named Maynard. It is a bloody battle, it is a costly battle. Ultimately, Maynard is successful, and they do kill and behead Blackbeard. Other names, Calico Jack Rackham. This is the most famous Jolly Roger we all see. Calico Jack Rackham, sailor, poor, successful captain. He was called Calico Jack because he liked to wear bright fabrics. He was sort of a dandy, and that he was split. He sailed under Charles Vane until he would kick Charles Vane out of the captaincy and took over. Next slide. Edward Lowe, another pirate. He came in the dawn of the Golden Age. He operated in the West Indies, North America, but he also started to expand out into the Indian Ocean and Madagascar. Here's his Jolly Roger. Next. Bartholomew Roberts, another famous captain. He came in the late, and it was usually considered when he was executed to be the end of the Golden Age. He had two flags, his first Jolly Roger, second Jolly Roger. Bartholomew Roberts operated in the Indian Ocean out of Madagascar, where they set up a pirate haven. He was incredibly successful, and he actually had a pirate armada. And so pirate armadas were not unheard of. And what would happen is if they captured a prize ship and they wanted to keep it, they would put a mate or another pirate on board, make him the captain, and they would sail in tandem. Steve Bonnet sailed with Blackbeard in tandem. Roberts met his end off the coast of West Africa in 1725, essentially bringing him into this age of piracy. Next slide. Others, there were women pirates. There are more than just these two women, but these are the two most famous, Mary Read and Bonnie. Mary Read was more tomboyish, for lack of a better phrase. She was able to pass off as a man. She fought in the English army in Queen Anne's War. She sailed out into the Caribbean, where she was found by Calico Jack in Nassau, and they joined her crew. With them came Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny and Mary Read went together. They sailed with Calico Jack. Interesting thing about these women is they broke gender stereotypes at the time. They also conformed to gender stereotypes at the time. And so a lot of time is presumed that when they were with their crew and they weren't fighting, they were at ease, that they would wear the women's clothing, the hair, the dresses, the goddesses, vice versa. But when they went to battle, they would dress more like men. For practical reasons, obviously you can't fight in a lot of women's clothing. There's also a lot of accounts that these women were much braver than most of their crew, including Calico Jack. And when they were eventually captured, Jack tried to surrender the ship, and the women were the ones who led around. Ultimately captured. At their trial, before they were sentenced to death, they told the judge that they were with baby. They commuted their sentence, and it turns out they were with baby, and they were locked up. They're lost to history at this point, so we don't know if they were executed or went back to some kind of society, or wait for the baby or not. They're lost to history. And so, as quickly as it came, the 10 years after the War of Spanish Succession to Bartholomew's death and the printing of general history, this golden age, the most successful age of piracy in history, most widespread, comes to an end. So does this presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
I know that they totally put on their ships. What games do they play or do how they do that?
Dice. They roll dice to the point where Bartholomew Roberts outlawed it because it would become a distraction. They only needed a fraction of the crew to sail, and so most of the time they would get drunk, which they also had to curtail, play games. They couldn't fight. Fighting was against the rules. They would create games, but a lot of dice and a lot of token games. Token games, little tokens. Interesting thing about life on a ship is most of the crew slept on deck because it's very hot and comfortable below decks. And so at any time when you're sailing, you have to walk around these people sitting on the deck. So, anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if pirates ever kidnapped women to take along on a voyage home for companionship instead of playing tokens or dice. A variety of activities.
Short answer is no. No.
So the STDs were internal?
Oh, that goes back to NASA. I don't want to get into that. There's a whole other thing about that. But no, the short answer is no, but there were some yeses. Henry Avery did it. He took the Mogul Emperor's daughter with them, and a lot of ladies in waiting. He ends up marrying them. The rest probably endured a lot. But there was one thing that kept women off ships at the time was sailors are incredibly superstitious. Incredibly superstitious. And women are bad luck. They got what they needed pulling in the port. Nassau was nasty saw, as in they could get comfort ladies and all the info they needed. Madagascar had natives, vice versa, pull into port somewhere else, and they get what they need. A lot of times they didn't get what they needed, and then they get a whole other subject, but buggery, as it was called at the time, was another pastime on these ships, made a lot of companionship. Did that answer your question? So a lot of that goes with the whole rumors of Catherine, deriving from Avery and being stereotypes as time goes on. Yes, sir.
I read that pirates and sailors alike, once the fighting started, they went barefoot. Because the decks would be all white, they were less apt to lose their footing if they were barefoot than if they were wearing shoes. Any truth to that?
There's a lot of truth to that, is that most sailors went barefoot because of what you said. The decks, you have sure footing with your feet, they fight, they sail barefoot. One of the biggest killers on board ships in combat is splinters. You're likely to be killed by a splinter, more likely to be killed by a splinter than a cannonball. These wind ships would get hit by a cannon or a shot with a splinter, and the splinter turns into missiles and kill you. But yes, they did fight barefoot almost all the time. And they pretty much lived barefoot. No time they put on shoes when they were ashore.
I didn't see it in any of your lectures, but I also read that oftentimes you see a pirate that's going to have a black patch on one eye.
Right.
And it's not because they lost an eye, but because a lot of the times they're going to be going below deck, either on their own ship or on another ship, and they wouldn't be able to see in the dark. But if they could slip that patch over the other eye, they have one eye that was accustomed to the dark. Is that true?
It was absolutely true. It was very clever. So that's one of the stereotypes that survived was a true stereotype, but it wasn't because they're missing an eye, because they probably just throw a glass eye in there and call it a day. It was to maintain their night vision. Anybody else? Welcome, yes.
Who's your favorite movie pirate?
Not a movie, but a TV show, and that's Captain Flynn from Black Sails. It's just, if anybody hasn't seen that show, it's worth watching. He's also the same captain from Treasure Island. He embodies the pirate spirit and pirate captain. Other ones would be, I like Treasure Island. It's one of my favorite breeds. And I like Long John Silver, especially because he makes very good fish. Actually, Steve Bonnet is one of my favorites now too, because there's a new show on HBO called Our Flag Means Death. It's about him, and it's incredibly funny. And it shows him in a different light. And oftentimes when I think about Steve Bonnet, I wonder first why he did it, and second when he crossed that line where he couldn't go back. He tried to get a pardon because he was a gentleman and it didn't work in the anger. Yes?
We had Somali pirates fairly recently. Are there any pirates still operating today?
Piracy is one of the oldest professions in the world, and while it has never been as widespread as it is there, it is very regional. And much like insurgencies, piracy spreads in low-income societies without a lot of government control. And so while we may look at the Somali pirates in a light that we condemn them, and by all means we can condemn them, but a lot of times they do it, the pirates themselves, because that is the only means of subsistence. You see that a lot. But then you go to the South China Sea, you have pirates there operating. Their whole thing is to steal cargo, kidnap people for ransom, vice versa. There's actually a whole industry now made up of shipboard protection. So a merchant will hire a crew, a mercenary, to fight these pirates in case that's needed. The Somali pirates were a big deal. They became even more big deal when they captured an American ship, because that's how things happen. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I wondered if you're aware of any U.S. Navy commanders who gained status, celebrity status, by capturing ships off the coast of the United States, for instance. You mentioned Charleston, other Delaware, where there were pirate ships on a regular basis. Anybody know that we should be aware of who gained I guess you could say, celebrity status by having captured or destroyed pirate ships?
Maynard, Lieutenant Maynard of the Royal Navy, had huge pirate celebrity status. Captain Cornigal, when he became a pirate hunter and stopped them, had celebrity status. And other governors and stuff. Most of the governors took credit for it. So Governor of Virginia or Governor of the Carolinas would take credit for it. Now, reversely, Thomas II was a pirate out of Rhode Island, and he gained notoriety. He was probably one of the more famous pirates operating out of the 13 colonies. A lot of them came out of Boston, such as Captain Flag. They came from all over in this area.
Where did you hide your loot when you worked?
In the store that I sent it. And so that also brings up the question, I think you're answering. What did they do with their loot? They spent it as soon as they could, because what's the point of holding on to it? And we think of pieces of eight and silver and all this other stuff that they would spend. It's true, but then you also have these baubles, these jewels. They would exchange slaves that they captured. They didn't free them. They would take a cargo and sell it. Anything they could to make money. Then they take that money, and next time they pull in the port, they just go nuts. They go back out to sea broke and go at it again. Yes?
Kind of pull on to my modest friend's question here. There was the cargoes. It wasn't like the stereotypical like piles of gold and things like that.
So just
sugar, and it was all these other very valuable things, sugar, molasses, and things like that.
Slang.
The ship itself, you can sell, right?
You can sell, and that also.
Anything you can sell, anything you can process.
They just found it.
Yeah.
Like Doug tells me, he has found something that fell on the truck.
And there was, that's pretty much all these ships carried, especially English ships. They didn't really carry hard currency like that. Problem with pirates in this age is the market dried up. As the Navy became more established and larger, as the colonies became more established as part of the English or the British Empire, the Spanish, there was no longer a lot of profit in reselling cargo. And so you'd have to find an unscrupulous landowner or merchant or something like that. And so they would sell it, maybe not for its worth, but wherever they could get, and they would split that up amongst the crew and snap right away.
So there was no like taking it back home to help your families or any of that, it was just each for themselves? They were not supporting anyone, just out to just survive?
Yeah, even if these men had families, the second they went on the account, which is what piracy was called, is that was it. There's no hope of them going back to shore. One captain who was on a ship sailing out, it was Boston. Well, he was a sailor, they mutinied their crew, he took over as captain, and then he realized that the days of going back to shore were over, and there's reports of him weeping over the daughter he left behind. It really messed with him because he would never see her again, because he couldn't. The second he goes back to Boston, he's gonna get hanged. And so no, there was not a lot of support. They might have had a girl in port that they thought was theirs, but so did 75 other pirates. Anybody else?
How about the opium ships, or the English merchant ships filled with opium coming back from India or from other places in the Far East? Is there any details you have on pirates hitting them up and doing what they would hope to do, is sell the opium?
Yeah, so East Indiamen have their own, they're much different than a lot of these normal types of ships. They come out of India, they're owned by the East India Company. But they're manned like a Royal Navy ship. They're armed like a Royal Navy ship because their voyages last from about 2 years on. And so they put as many people on board as they can, and they arm it as they can. But if you were able to take an East Indiaman, you're going to be set because it's full of spices, silks, opium. Everybody loves their opium, but alcohol was their biggest thing. And so, in a rare chance that they did take an East Indiaman, it was a very nice haul. And not only that, the ship itself could be very valuable because they're very formidable ships. Likely, the chances of them taking East Indiaman without being in a fleet or flotilla was low, but that would have been when Bartholomew Roberts and the Owens took it out of the Caribbean into the Indian Ocean, and that got they would plug on that. They also went for Indian ships, like the Mughal Empire, things like that, at this time because they also had some types of cargo. But they wanted vulnerable ships. Anybody else? This is a great line of questioning. I could talk about it all day.